Good morning. My name is Nathan Keller. I'm the minister of Anna Street Church of Christ. I don't normally do videos like this, dressed in this garb, especially since COVID is now not a thing of the past, but not as serious. We now go to church. Um, our audio went out yesterday, and I'm now uploading my sermon, and so that's what I'm doing. And please forgive me. There's no audience. There's no congregation. There's no worship to bring me into that spiritual mode. And so um, instead, I'm talking to a camera this morning. But it needs to be done. I need to get this lesson out. I think it's important, especially with the election on Tuesday. And I hope it'll make a difference for you. The first thing you need to realize is when we were at church yesterday, I had selected a scripture that comes from John chapter 1, where Jesus calls Nathanael. And in particular, Jesus says, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that." As a kid, I always wondered, why was Nathanael so excited about what Jesus had done? And the truth is, it's because he shouldn't have seen him. Maybe he was in another area of town. Jesus was not around. The point is, Jesus can see all things. That started getting me thinking about our lives as Christians. So I want to share with you a quote brought by George Washington. He said, "It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor." And that's where I got my title, "The Duty of All Nations." And so I want to talk to you this morning about how we as a nation are to acknowledge the providence of God. Because I believe that if we believe in the providence of God, it frees us to take part in government. It frees us to vote. I believe that if we believe in the providence of God, that it also gives us peace, even when we don't like how elections go. Now, one of my favorite books that talks about the providence of God is the book of Esther. So if you'll turn there with me, this is a neat story because we see Esther is a Jewish exile, her and her cousin Mordecai, and King Xerxes is trying to replace his queen, Queen Vashti, whom he stripped of royal authority. Well, she finds favor with everyone. She's a pretty lady. She has a great countenance. And so sure enough, he makes her queen. While she's queen, right after, Mordecai overhears this plot to kill King Xerxes. He tells the new queen, his cousin, Esther, who has kept her ethnicity, her Jewish nature, her Jewish being secret. And she tells Xerxes. Well, Xerxes, he's like, "Oh man," and he takes those guys and he punishes them for trying to kill him. He kills them. And it says that it was this salvation of Xerxes was credited to Mordecai. Well, in chapter 3, we see the antagonist, Haman, who does not like Mordecai because Mordecai refuses to bow. And so he vows in verse 6, he looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews. And so he rolls these dice. It's not really dice, but we'll call them dice. And these dice point him or show him the day that this death dealing would happen to all these Jews, which would be on the 13th day of Adar. Well, Mordecai figures this out in chapter 4, and Esther realizes he has figured it out, and she is beside herself. She thinks to herself, if I go before the king to say something, then that's illegal. If he doesn't raise a scepter to me, I'm dead. But Mordecai says this wonderful line. He says there in verse 14 of chapter 4, and who knows but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this. The Message says this: maybe you were made queen for such a time as this. Now, that's an important statement. Esther says, get a whole bunch of people. I'll get a whole bunch of people. Let's fast for 3 days, and then I'll go before the king, and if I perish, I perish. Now, the story continues. Sure enough, she goes before the king. He raises his scepter. She does not die because he loves her. And we see in chapter 5, she invites the king and Haman to a banquet. Haman goes home. He's so excited because the queen loves him too, he thinks. But he's got this little thorn in the flesh, Mordecai, who will not bow to him. So we see in verse 14 of chapter 5, his wife says, well, have Mordecai impaled on a pole. What a great thing to do. And he's like, okay, that's a great thing. Chapter 6, Haman is on his way to go talk to King Xerxes. And not Mordecai, but Xerxes is having a dream, and it wakes him up, and he can't go back to sleep. And he has the chronicler, the person who writes all the things down for the history of things that have happened in the court, come and read to him the chronicles. And he hears again about how Mordecai saved his life, and he says, did we do anything for Mordecai? And he says, no. He goes, what? We got to do something. And at that moment, Haman walks in, and he says, Haman, what do we do? I want to honor someone. And Haman thinks, oh, he's going to honor me. Of course, that's why he's asking me. And so we see chapter 6, verse 8. Have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. And right when he finishes, the king says, oh, that's a great idea. Haman, do that for Mordecai. And so Mordecai, I can just imagine his face just falls down, and he goes and he does this. And afterwards, he's taken to the banquet with Xerxes and Esther is just sad. And she says, my people, we're all doomed to die. And Xerxes says, what man has caused this to happen? And she points at Haman, chapter 7, verse 6, and says, an adversary, an enemy, this vile man Haman. And so the king is so irritated. He's so mad. He's enraged. He walks out. And as he's walking out, Haman realizes his life hangs in the balance. It is in Esther's hands. And so he starts to plead with her. He starts to beg with her until finally he accidentally falls on top of her right when the king comes in and sees him pawing at his wife. He says, chapter 7, verse 8, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? Well, before the words even finished exiting his mouth, Haman is taken and he is impaled on the same pole he made for Mordecai, but not before the king takes the signet ring and gives that to Mordecai. He can't reverse the law, but he tells them you can make a new law. So they make a new law that allows the Jews to protect themselves. And they do it triumphantly. And we see in chapter 9, in a neat turn of fate, they celebrate on the 14th and 15th day of Adar this feast called Purim, which is named after the same dice that Haman used to determine the 13th as the day of the genocide of the Jews. Chapter 10, verse 3 ends like this. Mordecai the Jew was second in the rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of the Jews. Maybe you were made for such a time as this. Now, Esther is a little deceptive. It is one of my favorite books about the providence of God, but it is deceptive because of its name. Its name is Esther, and it is not about Esther. I don't know if you've ever walked on a beach barefoot. I remember one of my favorite beaches to walk on was the Black Sand Beach in Hawaii. The grains of sand are so fine, that lava rock, that when you walk and you step out of the sand, it leaves a footprint behind, right? But not just the footprint. You see all the little creases and things in your foot. The reason I share that with you is because Esther, Haman, Xerxes, Mordecai, and all the events that occur that seem coincidental are all sand that is being shifted out of the way by this massive foot that has landed in the sand. And now the foot is gone, and we're left wondering what caused this foot or this footprint, because the foot's no longer here. Well, one of the things you find out in Esther is that the individual that it is about is not named. Esther is one of two books that does not mention the name of God, the one who caused the footprint. It is definitely a book, a story about the providence of God. And I keep coming back to what Mordecai says to her. He says, maybe you were made for such a time as this. It's like he's saying to Esther, you're part, I think, of God's divine plan, perhaps. So we see it is a story about God's providence. So we have to ask ourselves, what in the world does Nathan mean when he says God's providence? A lot of people don't understand that word. The prefix pro means forward, forth, or toward the front, almost like something beforehand. The suffix in the Latin word, vid, it's like this right now. You were watching this from a distance. You were streaming into a place you normally wouldn't get to see. You see it, vid, see. So the idea is that you see something. Providence is saying that God sees all things beforehand, around things. But not just that. To say that God sees all, we have to understand our pop culture. I was talking to a friend of mine who was telling me, he's about 80. He was telling me about some gospel meetings that he used to do as a kid. And they used to meet at the courthouse. They would have people from all denominations. They didn't care about denominations. And they would sing this one song that was called Watching You. Here's one line from it. Every day mind the course that you pursue. There's an all-seeing eye watching you. Now, God sees all things. You do things. People see many of those things, but there are some things you do at home or in private that no one sees. God sees that. God sees the things that happen and are said in your heart even. But that understanding sits wrong with people today, because if you tell them there's an all-seeing eye watching after you, watching you, what do they think of? Well, the eye of Sauron, of course, right? But that makes God feel villainous with one of his most important aspects. We're not talking about the providence of a diabolical, power-hungry monster. We're not talking about the providence of someone who means you harm. We're talking about the providence of someone who wants to protect you. It's like when Jesus is teaching in the temple and they bring this adulteress before him, throw her at his feet. They're trying to catch him in a trap with the law of Moses. And they say, the law says we should stone her. What do you say? Jesus begins to write on the ground. And then he stands up and says, he who has not sinned, cast the first stone. And then he starts to write again. Now, I think that if he just said, he who has never sinned, cast first stone, I think if he would have said that, it really would not have diffused the situation. It was in conjunction with whatever he wrote. Something that he put on the ground made them realize that they sinned. R.C. Sproul says perhaps he wrote Susie. And then a teacher dropped his rock and left. Perhaps he wrote tax evasion. Maybe he wrote down, this individual started a rumor about Harry, and they looked at each other and then they walked off. The point is, he knew what they were thinking in their hearts and the sins they had. He was provident, but he used it to protect this woman. We're not talking about the providence of someone who seeks to lead you astray. We're talking about the providence of someone that David characterizes as an individual who will lead you to green pastures, who will lead you to quiet waters, who will lead you in right paths because, as John says, he is a good shepherd. We are talking about the providence of a God who is compassionate and gracious, who Paul says works for the good of those who love him. The providence of God is meant to be something that doesn't cause discouragement, but joy, like the words of Sevilla de Martin, who wrote, "His eye is on the sparrow. When Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is he. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free, for his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me." The truth of the matter is, yes, God does see everything. He sees your private moments even, but because we follow Christ, because we know who he is, because we know about the cross, we celebrate. Now here's the deal. This is why I wanted to give this lesson before election. Providence happens to be one of the major Christian doctrines that used to be embraced in our country without question. You can find evidence of it in the Declaration of Independence when they talk about the inalienable rights all human beings have because of this Creator, which is uppercase. We see hundreds of years later, almost 200 years later, that during the Red Scare, when Russian communism was something that Americans feared in the 50s and 60s, that the Knights of Columbus pushed to add "under God" to our pledge. It didn't used to be there, in case you didn't know that. Eisenhower not only passed that into law, but he also passed a law that created the motto, "In God We Trust," which we now see on our money. And the reason is because he was trying to combat atheism and communism and increase patriotism. And there's no better way to increase patriotism than to appeal to a Christian supermajority at the time who believed in God's providence and to tell them he is provident. We do trust him. He is over us. But today we see that people who call themselves Christians quite often question the providence of God. While we see all the great things that happened in the 50s and 60s, about 8 years later, something else happened. Prayer was removed from school, and the reason is because it was deemed unconstitutional. I want to read to you a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to an Anabaptist church. He wrote, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." Now, everyone who is anyone has heard that fragment, wall of separation between church and state. Here's the problem. It's been grossly taken out of context. When we look at what Thomas Jefferson wrote here, he is quoting specifically the First Amendment, that the legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Is there anything about a school, a public school, full of people who are all Christians praying? Nothing whatsoever. And so there's been a terrible consequence. The result of this overusage of Thomas Jefferson's letter is that Christian men and Christian women have been unable to impact in a Christian way growing children who desperately need to be students of people who have faith in the providence of God and not faith in critical race theory, or faith in gender equality, or faith in the government even, the nation. Generation after generation, we have seen a growing separation between church and state. But here's the kicker. No longer is the state really concerned with the separation between church and state. When they say that, they're really saying the separation between God and state, which is why a lot of people are trying to reverse "In God We Trust" and take "under God" out. They have successfully compartmentalized God with the church, keeping him separate from the state, allowing them to free them to do whatever it is they want to do. As Christians, when you think about the election that's coming up, everything we followers of Jesus do is to point at the footprint that has caused all things. And like the book of Esther, even if they remove the word God from everything, you and I know better. He is in all things. He is over all things. He is through all things. And even our God can take things that evil, wicked men do and turn them into good. He's just that great. And we, as his followers, seek to glorify Jesus in all things. And that's why our belief in the providence of God is so important today. We are part of God's plan today. And like Mordecai told his cousin, maybe you were made for such a time as this. Now, there are kids today who, through God's providence, will shape this country, and how God's kingdom affects it through them. And so, for younger generations, I hope they hear me when I say this. It is by God's providence that the United States of America stands today. It is by God's providence that the founding fathers early on chose a democracy, and therefore it is by God's providence that Christians have the ability to affect the world in a way that Christians have never been able to do before. We have the opportunity to say, in God we trust, one nation under God. And we do that through the rights that are afforded to us, like the rights that were afforded to Paul as a Roman citizen who exercised those rights. And the reason he exercised those rights was so that he could go all the way to Caesar and proclaim to a king that Jesus Christ is the king. One of the things we find is that people say, you Christians are nice and all, but when you vote, you don't need to bring God with you. You don't need to bring Jesus with you in the voting booth, because this is not a theocracy. You got to keep that in mind. You got to separate yourself from Christ. You have a duty to our nation to do so. And I think we should resoundingly say, no. No. Our duty is not to our nation. It is the duty of this nation to acknowledge the providence of God. Why would we separate ourselves from Christ, who has given us the Spirit, has saved us, has made us into a new creation? We Christians, pilgrims of a foreign land, we celebrate the fact that in the kingdom of heaven, there is no separation of church and state, and that heavenly state graciously molds us into its citizens here in this fallen state. Let's face it, our Lord is the expert when it comes to how a government should be run. Why in the world would we keep him out of it? Now, we might easily say, I don't want to vote, I don't want to exercise my rights, and that's fine. There's a lot of people who do that. One of the reasons people, especially Christians, tend not to vote if they don't is because of people like David Lipscomb, who was a Church of Christ preacher right after Civil War. After seeing the atrocities, he said, you know what, it is not good for Christians to be involved with government or voting. And he preached just that. And he would quote Christ, who told Pilate, this kingdom, my kingdom is not of this world. But if we do that, isn't that like we're allowing the world to dig deeper into the idea that there's a separation between it and God? Aren't we giving into the world, into the fallen state, and into what the devil wants if we do that, with their mischaracterization of that? I keep remembering what Mordecai said to Esther. Maybe you were made for such a time as this. And in remembering those words, I feel responsible to tell you, I'm not promising you that there's going to be a great effect on voting day. I'm not promising you that it's going to change everything because let's be honest, our nation has not been a Christian supermajority for a while. But if we are people who believe in the providence of God, we know that he can take even what evil men do and make great things. And so, whether you vote or not on Tuesday, and I hope you understand, I'm not telling you that salvation requires you to vote. It's not what I'm saying. If you've heard nothing else, this is what you need to really take away. Whether you vote or not on Tuesday, and going forward in any elections and the time between and seeing what the government does well or poorly, whatever it is, please remember to put your faith in the providence of a loving God. He loves you dearly. He gave you Jesus. And Jesus died for you even when you were sinning, and he saw that. That's where his providence took you. To see you sinning even while he died for you. He doesn't do that because he hates you. He does that because he loves you. Because you're his creation. Because he wants nothing more than for you to be in his presence.